A father's embrace is sometimes hidden behind silence and harsh choices. For a long time, James and Tu Diep believed they were being pushed away by coldness and control. But beneath James' father's stern face lived a fear he never knew how to express. The fear that if James ever fell ill, if he ever collapsed under the weight of life, there would be no one strong enough left to hold him up. That fear turned into cruelty, and love was disguised as opposition. By separating James and Tu Diep, he believed he was forging strength through suffering, creating trials so extreme that only an unbreakable future could survive them. What they misunderstood was not his intentions, but his language of love, one built on sacrifice, fear, and a father's desperate need to protect his son, even if it meant becoming the villain in his own story.
People often say that the coldest winters are not made by the weather, but by the silence between those who once loved each other. For James, that winter began the day he realized his father's eyes no longer held warmth, only distance, calculation, and an authority that felt impossible to challenge, or at least that was how it seemed. James grew up believing his father was a man carved from stone. He spoke little, demanded much, and never explained his reasons. When James fell in love with Tu Diep, a woman whose life was built on honesty, simplicity, and quiet perseverance, his father's disapproval arrived swiftly and without mercy. No raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, just decisions made in closed rooms, contracts altered, doors quietly shut. To James and Tu Diep, it felt cruel. They had done nothing wrong. They loved each other in the most ordinary way, shared meals after long days, whispered worries under dim lights, dreams spoken softly so they would not break. Yet suddenly, their future was fractured. James was forced into impossible responsibilities. Tu Diep was pushed aside, as if her presence weakened him rather than strengthened him. "Your father wants control," James once said bitterly, staring at the city lights outside his window. "He doesn't believe in us."
Tu Diep did not argue, though her heart ached. She too believed that his father saw her as an obstacle, someone unworthy of standing beside his son. Each obstacle placed in their path felt deliberate: financial pressure, emotional distance, sudden demands that pulled James away when she needed him most. Love became something they had to defend rather than enjoy. And slowly, resentment grew. James began to see his father not as a protector, but as an enemy. Every illness, every moment of exhaustion, every time he faltered under pressure, only deepened his anger. Why push him harder when he was already struggling? Why tear apart the one place where he found peace? What James could not see, what neither of them could see, was the quiet fear hidden behind his father's rigid decisions. Fear that if James collapsed one day, there would be no one strong enough to hold him up. Fear that love alone would not save his son from a harsh world. Fear that if James became dependent on comfort, he would never survive loss. So the father chose distance over tenderness, cruelty over explanation, and in doing so, he became the villain in the eyes of the two people he was trying, in his own broken way, to protect. The tragedy was not the separation itself, but the misunderstanding that grew in the silence between them.
There are nights when even the strongest walls begin to crack. James's father knew those nights well, though no one ever saw him during them. When the house finally fell silent and the city outside dimmed its restless lights, he would sit alone in his study, hands resting on papers that felt heavier than stone. On those pages were plans, numbers, and decisions, each one meant to protect his son, yet each one pushing James further away. He remembered a time when James was small, when a fever could shake his entire body and fear would sit beside the bed until morning. Back then, love was simple. He held his son's hand and whispered promises he believed he could always keep. But as James grew, the world grew harsher, and love, he learned, had to change its shape. What haunted him most was the thought of James becoming fragile in a world that showed no mercy. He had seen men fall, not because they lacked intelligence or heart, but because, when they stumbled, no one was there to catch them. Illness, failure, betrayal, These things did not announce themselves. They arrived quietly, like shadows at dusk. So he hardened himself.
When Tu Diep entered James's life, his fear sharpened. She was kind, too kind, and kindness worried him. She loved James for who he was, not for what he could endure. To a father shaped by survival, that felt dangerous. What if James leaned too much on her? What if one day she could not protect him? What if love made him weak when strength was required most? These questions stayed unspoken, buried beneath strict orders and deliberate obstacles. He separated them not out of hatred, but out of a desperate belief. If James could survive losing love, he could survive anything. If James could stand alone, then illness, loss, and failure would never destroy him. Yet the cost was unbearable. From a distance, he watched his son grow tired, watched the anger replace trust, watched Tu Diep carry her pain with quiet dignity. Every step James took away from him felt like both proof and punishment. Proof that James was becoming independent, punishment because the price of that independence was their bond. Sometimes, in ordinary moments, watching a family cross the street together or hearing laughter from a nearby home, his chest tightened. He wondered if he had gone too far, if love, when stripped of warmth, became something unrecognizable. But pride and fear kept him silent. And so, while James believed his father was testing him out of control, the truth was far more human. A man terrified that one day his son would fall, and there would be no one strong enough left to save him.
There comes a moment in every life when silence speaks louder than truth. For James and Tu Diep, that moment arrived not with shouting or confrontation, but with distance, quiet, relentless distance that stretched between hearts once close. James mistook his father's coldness for cruelty. Each restriction felt like rejection, each obstacle like a deliberate act of harm. In his mind, love should protect, not wound. And yet every time he tried to move forward, with his career, with Tu Diep, with the fragile dream of a peaceful life, his father's shadow stood in the way. It was easy to believe that power, not fear, drove those actions. Tu Diep, too, carried her own misunderstanding. She saw a man using wealth and authority to control his son's fate, tearing apart a love that asked for nothing but honesty. In the quiet of early mornings, while preparing simple meals or walking Nee to school, she wondered how a father could choose ambition over his child's happiness. Her pain didn't erupt in anger, it settled into patience, the kind that slowly exhausts the heart. Yet beneath these assumptions lay a truth neither of them could see. James's father was watching from afar, measuring pain against survival. Each hardship he created was meant to sharpen James, to teach him how to stand when no one else would. But the lesson arrived wrapped in silence, and silence has a way of distorting meaning. Instead of strength, James learned resentment. Instead of resilience, Tu Diep learned doubt.
Everyday life continued, indifferent to their confusion. Bills still needed paying, work demanded attention, meals were cooked and eaten in quieter rooms. These ordinary moments, so familiar to anyone who has loved and lost at the same time, became heavier than dramatic arguments ever could. James grew restless, torn between anger and loyalty. He questioned himself late at night, staring at the ceiling, asking whether love was worth constant struggle. Tu Diep, on the other hand, learned endurance. She loved without demanding answers, but each unanswered question carved a small wound inside her. The tragedy was not that they suffered, but that they suffered separately. If James had known his father's fear, would his anger have softened? If Tu Diep had understood the fragile love hidden behind control, would her patience have turned into forgiveness? Perhaps. Or perhaps love, when tested too harshly, forgets how to listen. Misunderstanding, after all, does not destroy relationships overnight. It erodes them slowly, in everyday moments, until people wake up one day and realize they no longer recognize the distance between them. And somewhere in that growing silence, a father waited, hoping his son would become strong enough, yet fearing he might lose him forever.
The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and quiet regrets. It was the kind of place where time slowed, forcing people to confront truths they had postponed for years. James stood still for a long moment before entering the room, his hand hovering near the door as if the past itself were pressing against it. Tu Diep waited beside him, saying nothing, yet offering everything through her presence. Inside, his father looked smaller. The man who once filled rooms with authority now lay surrounded by soft beeping machines, his strength reduced to shallow breaths and tired eyes. When he saw James, something flickered: relief, fear, and an emotion he had never allowed himself to show: love. James expected anger. He expected explanations that came too late. Instead, he received silence, broken only by a trembling voice. His father spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of years unspoken. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that one day, if you fell, no one would be strong enough to help you stand." In that moment, the walls James had built began to crack. He finally saw the truth behind the cruelty he had imagined, the misguided protection, the love expressed through hardship rather than warmth. His father reached out, fingers weak but desperate, and James instinctively took his hand. That touch erased years of distance.
Tu Diep watched quietly, tears forming not from sorrow, but from understanding. She realized then that love does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it wears the face of fear. Sometimes it chooses harsh lessons over soft comfort, believing pain today will prevent greater pain tomorrow. Outside the hospital window, life continued. Cars passed, people laughed. Somewhere, families argued over trivial things. The world, as always, moved forward. Yet inside that room, 3 hearts shifted. James leaned forward and embraced his father, an awkward, fragile hug, but real. It was not forgiveness in full, nor was it forgetting the past. It was something braver: acceptance. For the first time, James's father allowed himself to be held. And in that embrace, all of them understood a simple truth that daily life often hides. Love is not always wise, but it is almost always human. Sometimes we misunderstand those who love us most, and sometimes it takes losing control to finally open our arms.
This story reminds us that love does not always speak the language we expect. Often, we believe that love must be gentle, encouraging, and easy to recognize. Yet in real life, love is sometimes expressed through fear, control, and silence, especially when it comes from those who feel responsible for protecting us. The tragedy begins not because love is absent, but because it is misunderstood. One of the deepest lessons is that fear can disguise itself as authority. James's father did not act out of cruelty, but out of an overwhelming fear of losing his son to weakness, illness, or failure. Instead of teaching strength through trust, he chose hardship as a shield. Many parents in everyday life make similar mistakes, believing that strictness and pressure will prepare their children for a harsh world. Without communication, however, good intentions can become emotional wounds. The story also teaches us about the cost of silence. James and Tu Diep suffered not because the truth was unbearable, but because it was never spoken. Silence allowed assumptions to grow, turning protection into rejection and concern into control. In daily relationships between parents and children, partners, or even friends, unspoken fears often cause more damage than honest conflict ever could. Another important lesson is the power of empathy. When James finally saw his father not as an obstacle, but as a frightened man who loved imperfectly, his anger softened. Understanding did not erase the past, but it created space for healing. Likewise, Tu Diep learned that forgiveness does not mean denying pain. It means choosing compassion over resentment. Ultimately, the story reminds us that love is not measured by perfection, but by willingness to reflect, to admit mistakes, and to embrace vulnerability. Life is short, and pride often steals time we can never recover. When we choose to listen, truly listen to the hearts behind the actions, we give love a second chance to become what it was always meant to be.